The private dining room smelled of dark wood and old wine. Long table, silver service. 12 men and 4 women who moved through the evening with the ease of people who had never had to consider the cost of anything on the table. Family portraits on the walls. Men in black suits going back 3 generations, their mouths set in the same careful expression. The expression of people who had learned that showing nothing was its own kind of power. Celeste was pouring the second round of Barolo when the old man spoke. She recognized Vittorio Moretti from the photographs in the hallway. 70-something. Jacket pressed with military precision. Hands that had done things and had learned to be still. He said it without looking at her, said it to the man beside him. Salvatore, in a dialect so old most people in the city had never heard it spoken aloud. Not a working language, a graveyard language. The kind kept alive only by people who needed a private code and believed no one under 60 could understand a word of it. He said, "They hire women built for harvest and dress them in black, as if silk could teach grace to a body made for carrying grain." 3 men laughed. Celeste finished pouring. She set the bottle down. Then she answered him in the same dialect, with the same cadence, the same dropped consonants, the same rhythm of a language that had no official grammar and had been passed mouth to ear for 200 years in a province that no longer existed on any map. She said, "Silk does not teach grace. It only reveals who has none." The table went quiet. Vittorio turned his head. She looked at him directly. He asked in Italian, "Who taught you that tongue?" "My great-aunt, her name." Celeste said, "Rosa Marino." He almost breathed again. Rosa had always told her, if anyone outside the family ever recognized the dialect, watch their face before you decide whether to run. Vittorio's face was already telling Celeste that running would be too late. So instead of running, she did the one thing Rosa had never taught her to do. She pushed. But that was not the name she was born with. She reached under the collar of her uniform and drew out a fine chain. On it, a signet ring, old silver. A pattern pressed into it. A crest no one at this table had seen worn openly in 27 years. Her family was Bellacorte. The crystal slipped from Vittorio's hand. Salvatore was on his feet before it hit the tablecloth. A capo at the far end of the table made the sign of the cross. Dante Moretti, who had been watching from the far end of the room, with the particular stillness of a man who catalogued everything and revealed nothing, looked at his father. What he saw was not anger, it was recognition. Celeste said, in the old dialect, "You buried the family, you forgot to bury the language." Then she picked up the bottle and offered a refill to the woman on her left, because the work was still there and she still needed to be paid. Cut to 3 hours earlier. The kitchen entrance of the Moretti house was not glamorous. It smelled of garlic and industrial soap and the specific anxiety of catering staff preparing for a dinner where every detail would be noticed, and none of them would be thanked for it. Bianca Moretti moved through the kitchen the way restaurant operators moved, checking everything twice, acknowledging nothing that was already correct, correcting everything that wasn't. She stopped at Celeste. No speaking to guests unless spoken to, no looking at Vittorio directly. Do not enter the west corridor. Do not touch anything on the sideboard. The crystal in tonight's service is older than most of the staff. She paused. And whatever you think you hear at the table, you didn't hear it. Celeste looked at the tray she was assembling. I speak 3 languages. I am very good at not understanding things. Bianca studied her for a moment, decided that was satisfactory, and moved on. Dante came through the kitchen at 7:15. He moved the way men moved when they were checking on things they trusted but wanted to see anyway. He looked at the table layout, the wine order, the service positioning. He looked at Celeste, who was realigning the crystal because the staff assigned to the task had used the wrong configuration for the Barolo glasses. He said, "Are you the sommelier or the waitress?" "Tonight. Whichever one prevents your father from complaining about the Barolo service." Something moved across his expression, not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement that something had registered. He left without another word. The first sign came during the antipasto course. Vittorio was speaking to Salvatore and used a word Celeste had heard only once before, from her great-aunt, on a night when Rosa had woken from a dream and sat at the kitchen table until dawn, speaking to no one. The word meant, roughly, a man who betrays his table and deserves to be left unburied. It was not a word from any textbook, not from any academic record of the dialect she had been able to find. It was the kind of word that lived only in oral tradition, passed down by people who had specific use for it. No one under 70 in this city should have known it. Vittorio used it with complete comfort, the ease of someone who had grown up hearing it. Celeste continued serving, but she was listening differently now. The dining room reformed itself after the crystal incident. Salvatore moved towards Celeste. Dante said, "No one moves." The word came out flat and without emphasis, which was how Dante said the things that were not suggestions. Salvatore stopped. Bianca looked at the family portrait above the fireplace. 3 generations of Moretti men, with an expression Celeste would later recognize as the look of someone recalibrating everything they thought they knew about a wall they had always taken for granted. A capo at the far end of the table stood and walked out without a word. Dante said in Italian, "Leave the room." The table emptied. Vittorio did not move. Dante brought Celeste to the library, not with force. He held the door open and waited, which was its own kind of statement. He asked 3 questions without inflection, the way someone asks questions when they already know some of the answers and need to locate where the information ends. Who taught you the dialect? What do you know about Bellacorte? Who sent you here tonight? Celeste answered all 3. Her great-aunt, who had forbidden her to speak it in front of strangers and never fully explained why. A name in a lullaby, and the way Rosa's face changed whenever the Moretti name appeared on television. A catering agency assignment, the same as any other, except this one paid enough to cover Rosa's care costs for a month. "No one sent me," she said. "I took the job." He looked at the signet ring, which she had taken off the chain and set on the arm of the chair beside her. That ring belonged to someone. My mother. She died when I was 4. Rosa raised me after that. She had already raised my mother from the night she arrived at Rosa's door at 19. Celeste looked at her hands. Rosa never told me where the ring came from. She never told me why we moved every 3 years or why she cut our faces out of any photograph that showed us in public. She just taught me the language and the prayers and the songs and said one day I would understand why she kept them. She paused. I understood tonight. Vittorio appeared in the library doorway. He was composed. He had had 10 minutes and had used them well. His face showed nothing, his voice was measured, his hands were at his sides. He said Bellacorte was a name that died with a family that had destroyed itself, that the ring was a known reproduction used by grifters to extort old Mafia families, that someone had found a girl who looked the part and taught her a few phrases. Then he said, "Send her home, Dante. Some debts cannot be reopened." Celeste said, "If the name means nothing, why are you afraid to hear it?" Vittorio looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Dante. Dante was watching his father's hands. Celeste called before they drove anywhere. Dante stood by the library window while she dialed. He did not ask to listen. She put the phone to her ear and said, in the old dialect, that she had said the name at the table tonight, and that Vittorio's son was standing in the room with her, and that she needed to know if it was safe to bring him to Rosa's door. There was a long silence on the line. Then Rosa said one sentence, also in the dialect, in a voice that had gone very quiet. "Lucia's boy. Bring him. No one else." Celeste lowered the phone. "She knows your name. She doesn't know me. She just used your mother's name before I said yours." Dante didn't move for a moment. Then he told Matteo to wait at the house, and they went alone. Rosa Marino lived in a third-floor apartment that smelled of rosemary and old coffee, and the specific warmth of a space that had been kept small on purpose. She was awake when they arrived, which surprised Celeste. Rosa was usually asleep by 9. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the prayer book open in front of her. She looked at Dante for a long moment before she spoke. "You have her eyes," she said in Italian. "Lucia showed me your photograph at the station. You were 8 and missing a tooth. She took it back before she left because she was afraid your father would notice it had been out of her wallet. You were 8. You were missing a tooth in the picture." Dante's hand moved toward his own jaw, an old unconscious gesture. "You knew my mother." "I knew her for one night," Rosa said. "It was enough." She looked at Celeste and said, "I knew this day would come. I hoped it would not be so soon." Rosa told it the way old women tell things that have been kept too long, not all at once, and not in order, but in the sequence of what she could no longer stand to leave unsaid. 27 years ago, Vittorio Moretti had invited the Bellacorte leadership to a peace meeting, an alliance, an end to competition over the Eastern Harbor shipping routes. 14 people attended. The building was locked from the outside before dawn. Rosa had not been in the building. She was the aunt of the Bellacorte Don, her brother, not leadership herself, and she had been sent home before the meeting began because Bellacorte men were traditional that way. She found out at 3 in the morning when her brother's second-in-command arrived at her door with a young woman, Isabella, 19 years old, her brother's daughter, Rosa's niece. Rosa's brother had sent Isabella away the night before, with instructions that Rosa memorized and repeated to Celeste now, precisely as she had received them. "If I do not return by morning, take her north, change everything. Teach her the language so she is never lost. Tell her nothing so she cannot be made to speak." Rosa had done all of it. She had raised Isabella as her own daughter through the rest of her growing up, and 3 years later, when Isabella had a child of her own, Rosa had raised that child too. First as a great aunt, and after Isabella died in every way that mattered. "You called me your grandmother your whole life," Rosa said to Celeste and I never corrected you, because by the time you could ask, it had become true in every way except blood. Almost all of it she had done. She looked at her hands. I kept the ring. I kept the book. I kept the ledger. She looked at Celeste. I should have burned them, but they were all I had left of everyone. Dante said, "My father told me Bellacorte killed my mother." Rosa looked at him the way people look at someone who has been lied to so thoroughly that they do not yet know how much work the truth will require. "Your mother discovered the plan," she said. "She tried to warn the Bellacorte men. She arrived too late." A pause. "She found Isabella waiting at the rail station, the way she'd been told to. She put her on the train herself, with money sewn into her coat lining." Another pause. "Then she drove home. It was winter. Ice on the road. An accident," Dante said. "Perhaps." The silence that followed was the kind that reconfigures what came before it. Dante looked at Matteo's empty chair, then caught himself. Matteo wasn't there. He'd left him at the house. He took out his phone instead and began typing notes himself. Rosa placed 3 things on the table. A prayer book, old, water-stained, the cover worn to almost nothing. A signet ring, the mate to the one Celeste wore on her chain. A partial ledger, 12 pages handwritten in a mixture of Italian and the old dialect. The header read, "Eastern Harbor Holdings, ownership record." There was a 4th item, Rosa said, a cassette tape, a recording Isabella made the year before she died, for you. She looked at Celeste. The tape deteriorated. I could recover only part of it. She played it on a recorder so old it looked like something from a different era, a woman's voice, careful, speaking quickly, saying, "If anything happens to me, remember the name. Remember that Vittorio does not know." Then static, then silence. "That was all I could recover," Rosa said. Celeste stared at the recorder. Dante's face had gone the kind of still that meant something internal had broken, and the exterior had not yet registered it. They were back at the Moretti house by midnight, in a downstairs room that Dante used for conversations he did not want above ground. He said, "A ring and a partial recording and the testimony of an 80-year-old woman are not evidence." "I know," Celeste said. "Even if everything Rosa said is true, Bellacorte inheritance requires documentation. The Harbor Trust, if it still exists, would require—" "I know," he looked at her. "Verify me," she said. "I am not asking you to take my word for anything. I am asking you to look." Matteo had been waiting at the house since they left, and he'd used the hours. He said, "Eastern Harbor Holdings is still an active trust. I found it in the state registry while you were at Rosa's apartment." He looked at Dante. 60% Bellacorte, 40% Moretti. The Bellacorte share was transferred by death certification after the fire. He paused. "I found 3 irregularities in the certification process. The room was quiet." 3, Dante said. "Enough to challenge the transfer if a surviving heir could be documented." The prayer book was not a prayer book. Celeste had suspected it since the age of 15, when she noticed that several of the saints' day verses used words that did not exist in any version of the liturgy she could find. Rosa had dismissed her questions. Old dialect. Local variations. Don't look too closely. Now, with the ledger beside it, she understood. The prayer book was a location key. Every feast day corresponded to a warehouse. Every named saint corresponded to a dock number. The verses themselves were inventory records. Encoded in the rhythm of prayer, so they could be memorized and transmitted without anyone who found the book being able to read it. She worked through it for 40 minutes at the kitchen table while Dante read the ledger and Matteo worked the phone. When she was done, she had a partial set of coordinates, enough to point to a property, not yet enough to say what was inside it. It pointed to a specific section of a wine cellar under a property that Moretti had acquired 26 years ago. 1 year after the fire. She showed Dante. He looked at the address. "That's our family house," he said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "What will you do," he said, "if this proves everything?" Celeste looked at the prayer book, at a fragment of a record kept in the language of saints because it was the only safe place to hide it. "I don't know," she said. "I haven't let myself think that far," he said. "You could take half the harbor. That is not the same as getting my family back." The wine cellar was 3 levels below the Moretti house. It smelled of stone and the particular cold of ground that had not seen daylight in decades. The racks went back 20 meters, bottles from years Celeste had not been alive to see, labels from estates and regions that meant nothing to her and everything to the family that had built this collection as a monument to what they had accumulated. Bianca came down with them. She had not been asked. She had simply appeared at the cellar door with a flashlight and said, "If you find something, you'll want a witness who isn't on either side of this." Dante looked at her. "I've been watching my uncle run the restaurant side of this family for 6 years," she said. "I want to know what we're actually built on." The prayer book's coordinates led them behind the 3rd rack on the north wall. Not a secret door, just a gap where a rack had been placed at a slightly wrong angle for 26 years, wide enough to slide a flat box through if you knew it was there. The box contained the original Eastern Harbor Holdings Partnership Agreement. Both signatures, both seals, port maps with handwritten annotations, cargo routes, dock assignments, revenue splits in 2 different handwritings, a payment ledger for the year before the fire. The last entry, 2 weeks before the meeting, was in a different ink, SG, confirmation received, building secured, SG Salvatore Greco. Celeste closed the box and sat back on her heels. "This is the Bellacorte side of it. My great-uncle's records. They explain the trust. They don't explain your mother." Dante was already moving down the row of racks, counting bottle years under his breath, vintages that meant something to a family that marked its private history through what it drank and when. He stopped at a bottle from the year his mother died. It wasn't a bottle. The neck and shoulders were real glass, but the base had been hollowed and refitted, heavier than it should have been. He worked it open at the kitchen table later, carefully, the way you open something you suspect you'll regret opening. Inside, 4 handwritten pages in a woman's careful script. The signature at the bottom, Lucia M. "Someone hid this separately," Celeste said, "not with the Bellacorte box." "My mother hid it," Dante said. "She knew exactly what this house was. She didn't trust the cellar to keep her words safe in the same place as theirs." He read all 4 pages standing in the wine cellar, in the cold, with a flashlight in his hand and 3 people waiting without speaking, because something about his face made clear that this was not a moment that could be managed or softened. He read all 4 pages. Then he folded them carefully, put them back inside the bottle, and set it down on top of the Bellacorte box. He said, Salvatore took the last page of her witness statement. There's a line here that says, "Continued," on the back of the third sheet, and the third sheet has no back. Celeste said, "He was in the payment ledger too, SG. Yes, he knew this house held something, he just never found it." "No," Dante said, "he found part of it. 26 years ago, someone filed a fire insurance claim on this property in our family's name 4 days after the fire, even though Bellacorte had owned the building outright. Matteo found that filing in the public archive last week, before any of this started, because he'd been quietly auditing my father's holdings for irregularities on his own. He didn't know what it meant until tonight." He looked at Celeste, at the woman who had carried an entire dynasty into his house without knowing it, and at the 4 pages from his dead mother, that the house had been built to bury under wine. He did not say anything else. There was nothing to say that the pages had not already said better. Upstairs, the cellar's old motion log, original to the renovation, still wired to a private line no one had thought to disconnect in 26 years, registered a door opening for the first time since the seal was placed. The alert did not go to Dante. It went to a number still listed under Vittorio's private security account. Salvatore answered on the first ring. Matteo's phone rang at 2:14 a.m. One of his contacts. 2 words. Salvatore moved. Celeste's phone rang 30 seconds later. A number she didn't recognize, then a voice she did. Rosa. Speaking in the dialect, the way she did only when she was frightened. "North door, don't let them use fire." The line cut. Salvatore had taken Rosa to the Eastern Harbor cold storage facility, the original Bellacorte warehouse. Now Moretti property for 26 years. Still operating, still generating revenue, still carrying the altered address that had replaced the Bellacorte name when the transfer documents were filed. Dante said, "I'll bring. Wait." Celeste looked at the building plan Matteo had on his phone. The cold storage system runs on gas lines from the 1980s. They haven't been upgraded because the building hasn't been inspected honestly in years. She looked at Dante. If Salvatore gets cornered, he knows how this family solves problems. Fire is not a metaphor to him, it is a method. Silence. He'll use it if pushed, she said. On a building full of gas lines and Rosa inside, Dante was quiet. "What are you proposing?" Celeste looked at the map. Rosa had taught her the language, but she had also taught her something else. A specific phrase, embedded in a specific song that had seemed for 20 years like a verse about a shepherd and a bell. It was not about a shepherd. It was a signal, an old Bellacorte signal, used by families who needed to coordinate across a building without radio or phone, in a time when walls had ears but voices in the right register could move through stone. When the bell sounds twice, the north door opens. She explained it to Dante in 30 seconds. He looked at Matteo. Matteo looked at Bianca. Bianca said, "I can get to the building's sprinkler panel from the maintenance access on the south side. I know the system. I ran the inspection filing last year. It took 11 minutes to get to the harbor." Dante and Matteo went in through the loading bay. Bianca took the south access. Celeste went to the intercom panel on the east wall, the external one, used for delivery coordination, and found the channel Rosa would recognize. Inside, a man Celeste didn't know stood near Rosa with one hand on her shoulder, not gripping, just present, the kind of casual control that didn't need to be a threat to work. Celeste said nothing in Italian. She sang 2 lines of the shepherd's song in the old dialect with the bell phrase at the end, twice. Then, because a song alone might not be enough against a hand on someone's shoulder, she did the other thing she'd planned. She read, slowly and clearly over the intercom in the old dialect, the line from the ledger she'd memorized in the cellar. SG, confirmation received. Building secured. Inside the building, Rosa heard the song first and stood, slow and unhurried, because she had lived 80 years in hiding, and understood that the worst thing a person could do in a dangerous room was give the room a reason to act. The guard at her shoulder heard the ledger line second, and his hand tightened, not on Rosa, but on his own phone, because he recognized the words and didn't know how she could. That half-second of distraction was enough. The sprinklers activated. In the darkness and the sudden cold water, the guard turned toward the door instead of toward Rosa. Bianca's hand on the panel had also tripped the fire door release, old code, required by an inspection Bianca herself had filed, that unlocked emergency exits the moment the system engaged. Rosa reached the north door and found it already swinging free. She pushed it open and walked through. Dante's men were on the other side. Salvatore had his weapon up when Dante came through the loading bay. "Your initials are in the ledger," Dante said. "SG confirmation received. Building secured. My mother named you in her statement on the page you tore out, but you didn't tear out the line before it where she wrote that she'd told you to stop and you didn't." Salvatore's jaw worked once. "There's nowhere left for this to go, Salvatore," Dante said. "The cellar's open, the ledger's out. My father knows by now that I know." Salvatore looked at Dante, at the Don who had been born after the fire, who had grown up on a story Salvatore had helped to write, and lowered the weapon, not from exhaustion. From the simple arithmetic of a man who understood that every door in the building had just closed at once. Vittorio arrived at the harbor at 3 in the morning. He had not been called. He came because Salvatore had been unreachable for 40 minutes. And because Vittorio had spent 27 years monitoring the specific frequency of problems that did not announce themselves, and this silence had that frequency. He walked in through the main entrance and found the room arranged in a way he had not anticipated. Salvatore seated, Matteo standing beside him, Bianca near the wall, Rosa Marino at the far end of the building, wrapped in a jacket Celeste had given her, looking at Vittorio with an expression that contained 27 years of waiting. And Dante standing in the center of the room, holding a stack of documents. Vittorio looked at the documents, then at his son, then at the woman beside his son. He said, "Everything you have built exists because I ended their name. That is the truth of this family." Dante said, "Then none of it was ever ours." Vittorio did not confess. Men like Vittorio did not confess. They justified. They constructed the architecture of survival and presented it as proof of necessity. He said Bellacorte had been building toward a takeover for a decade, that the alliance meeting had been their ultimatum, not his invitation, that Moretti would have been absorbed or destroyed within 5 years. He said Lucia had not understood the stakes, and that her accident was exactly what he had said it was. He said a dead family's heir arriving at a dinner party with a ring and a story was not inheritance. It was theater. Dante listened to all of it. Then he laid the documents on the floor between them, one by one. partnership agreement, payment ledger with Salvatore's initials, insurance claim in the wrong name, 4 pages in his mother's handwriting. Vittorio looked at the pages. He looked at them for a long time. He did not speak, and in the silence, the justifications became what they had always been, the specific grammar of a man who had told a story so many times he had begun to believe the story was the same as the truth. "I did what survival required," he finally said. Celeste said quietly, "History does not belong to the family that survives. It belongs to the one allowed to write it." Vittorio looked at her. He said nothing else. Dante spoke to the capos at 7 that morning. He did not explain everything. He said that financial and legal irregularities in the Eastern Harbor Trust had been identified, that an internal review was opening, and that his father was removed, effective immediately, from all advisory, financial, and operational authority pending its outcome. His private security detail was reassigned. No capo was to take his calls without going through Dante first. He said it once. He did not raise his voice. He did not invite questions. Vittorio did not argue. He had looked at 4 pages in his dead wife's handwriting and had nothing left to say that the documents did not already refute. Salvatore was taken from the harbor by 2 men who had been with Dante since before he took the title. Matteo began the trust challenge, filing the following morning. Dante found Celeste outside the harbor building, standing at the water's edge in the gray of early morning. He stood beside her. She said, "I want to ask you something." "Yes." "The harbor, the trust, the ownership record." She looked at the water. "When Matteo completes the challenge, what happens to Moretti?" He was quiet for a moment. A contested transfer means a legal review. The port operations continue under court supervision while the claim is processed. If the claim succeeds, 60% of the trust reverts to the Bellacorte heir. He paused. "To you, and your family loses half of what your father built it on." "Yes." She was quiet. "Is that why you helped me?" she said. "To get ahead of it?" "No." "Then why?" He looked at the water. "Because my mother tried to stop it," he said, "and died on an icy road 3 days later. And I was 8 years old, and my father told me Bellacorte was the reason." He was quiet. "I have spent most of my life angry at the wrong people. I would like to stop." She looked at him for a moment, then, without entirely deciding to, reached over and took the 4 pages from his coat pocket, the ones he'd been carrying since the cellar, unwilling to let them out of his hands, and held them between them so they were both looking down at his mother's handwriting at once. Their hands were close on the paper. Neither of them moved them apart. "She has good handwriting," Celeste said. "She was a school teacher before she married my father. He never let her teach again." Dante's voice was rough. "I think she would have liked you." Celeste didn't answer that. She didn't need to. She folded the pages closed and handed them back, and let her fingers stay against his palm half a second longer than the handoff required. 3 months later, the Eastern Harbor Trust was in active review. The legal process moved the way legal processes move, slowly, with documentation and counter-filings and adjustments that would take the better part of a year to resolve. Celeste was not waiting for it. She had submitted the trust challenge. She had worked with Matteo on the documentation. She had given Rosa the option to be the named heir, and Rosa had said very firmly that she was 80 years old and had no interest in harbors. What Celeste had decided, the first morning at the water's edge, was that 60% of a port's revenue would fund a great deal of the thing she actually wanted. The Bellacorte Marino Archive of Sicilian oral history opened in a rented space in the city's north end. 2 rooms, a donated recording setup. A researcher from a university who had spent 11 years trying to find living speakers of the dialect and had been told consistently that there were none. Rosa sat with him for 4 hours on the first day. She talked about the language the way she had never talked about it to Celeste, not in fragments and songs, but in full sentences, in the living texture of it, in the way it sounded when an entire family spoke it across a table rather than one old woman alone in a kitchen. Celeste sat nearby and took notes and felt something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but something in between, the specific weight of a door opening onto a room that had been sealed for a very long time. Dante came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the archive opened. He did not send someone first. He came himself on foot, in a coat that made him look less like a Don and more like a man who had not slept quite enough and was carrying something heavier than his jacket. He stood in front of the sign for a moment. Bellacorte Marino Archive of Sicilian Oral History. He came inside. Celeste was at the desk, writing up notes from Rosa's morning session. She looked up. "Did you come to inspect what I did with your harbor?" she said. "It was never mine." She set down her pen. They looked at each other across the small room, across the months, across the harbor water, across everything his family had taken, and everything she had decided to build instead. He said, "My father taught me that names were weapons." Celeste said, "They are also homes." He looked at the recordings on the shelf. The cassette, the new recordings in labeled folders, the prayer book under glass. "Would you teach me?" he said. "The language." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I don't want the language my family tried to erase to remain something I can only hear secondhand," he said. "From you, when I'd rather learn it from you directly." The room was quiet. She pulled a chair from behind the desk and set it across from her own. She sat down. She taught him the first phrase. He said it wrong. She said it correctly, slowly, with the specific patience of someone who had learned everything she knew from an old woman's kitchen table at midnight. He tried again. Better. Then he looked at her and said, in careful Italian, "Dinner." "Not a question," she said. "Ask properly." He took a breath. He tried the phrase in the dialect, slowly, without pretending it was more fluent than it was, without performing certainty he had not yet earned. She let him finish. She said yes. Vittorio Moretti had tried to erase a family by killing its name, stealing its harbor, and burying its language. He failed because language does not survive in buildings or ledgers. It survives in the mouths of people taught to remember. And the waitress he insulted had carried an entire dynasty into the room without knowing it. If the language your family taught you revealed that everything you knew about your past was a lie, would you claim the inheritance or walk away from the empire built on it? Tell me in the comments, when did you first realize Vittorio already knew the name Bellacorte? Subscribe to Underworld Desire for more stories about underestimated women who carry secrets powerful families thought they had buried forever.